System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' inner city left.
This is the Inner City Left broadcast. I am Amin TMK. Today is Monday, December 2nd. I am here with Emoja Lil Tanky Sumler and our special guest. He's been on a few times, but he's still special to me, Matt Sedillo. Matt, how are you doing, Matt? Yeah, no problem, man. How are you doing?
If I was doing better, my name would be Amin TMK. I'm actually out here in Guadalajara for the book festival. So.
Yeah, he's a traveling man. Friends. I just want to say again a little bit just before we get started, Matt. That Matt is a Chicano political poet, essayist, and activist. He has 2 books out right now. I want to go ahead and just plug those, and I will also put them in the description. Mowing Leaves of Grass and City on the Second Floor. Again, thank you everyone for showing up. Appreciate y'all. We got a good conversation today. We want to talk a little bit about sort of these multinational corporations, these transnational corporations, and the impact that they have all over the world. There's obviously several of them. We were talking a little bit before this and mentioning some of them. So, I was thinking maybe we could start maybe with like East India Company or Chiquita Banana. I would throw it to you, Matt, maybe and just give us a discussion about those things and in general, how these corporations are exploiting, these developing nations.
Well, I mean, when you look at the question of the Dutch East India Company, I think that's a really great place to start the conversation because the Dutch East India Company is formed really almost simultaneously with the actual nation of the Netherlands. I think oftentimes we think of things like these companies as being, it's like rather cynical that a war is waged for a government. For a company, but rather noble or normal that a war be waged over like a nation state. These nation states are something that are sacrosanct, that are quasi holy, whereas a company is like people will die for Uncle Sam but not Mickey Mouse, right? And that's the kind of idea that we have in this country, or I'm gonna mix right now, but that's the idea that we have about nation states. That we'll die for some abstraction called the nation state, but not a company. But if you look at the actual foundation of the Dutch East India Company, which for the first 40, 50 years of its existence actually dominated the British East India Company as well as other corporations. It pushed the Portuguese out of Indonesia, what's now Indonesia, and really made a lot of money and made a killing, both literally and figuratively. There. And so the Dutch East India Company, like the British East India Company, had armies. They had armed. They had essentially armed mercenaries working for them, the size and scale of a modern military, or at the time a military that would be put together by a nation state. Now the way it worked was that the Dutch East India Company was that basically people would just buy into this, like kind of like the stock market. And the interesting thing about the Dutch East India Company, why it was initially bigger than the British East India Company, is that people could buy into, like not necessarily own a boat, but own like a piece of a boat. So all that kind of fractional banking, fractional investing, all these kinds of the derivative things that we would later see in the market here in the United States really have their roots in the Dutch East India Company, even before Britain was doing that. Britain later would do that as well, but like the Dutch East India Company was really kind of the pioneer in doing that, and the kind of fractional investment kind of thing. And so, yeah, but that really, the point I'm making is that it was actually founded at the same time as a nation state. But you have quotes in the United States from early founding fathers talking about the importance of protecting the market, and the point of the government was to protect the market. Woodrow Wilson literally saying that wherein it's the government's responsibility to open the doors of trade, wherein they will not allow it. We must batter down the doors. Later, you have Milton Friedman saying that trade is democracy, that a market is democracy, and any country that is not willing to open the market is inherently undemocratic. And he's saying this in championing the war against Salvador Allende, which is fought for Anaconda copper, for the copper mines of Chile. And so we see all this going. It's rooted in the earliest days of capitalism, this merger of the state and capital. It's interesting to me, like oftentimes you'll call the thing fascist, and be like, you see someone like a bunch of Nazis marching down the street or a bunch of Klansmen marching down the street, like this bunch of fascists, and then someone will inevitably come out and try and correct you, like, well, fascism is actually the merger of da 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 da. But if you really look at the way capitalism was formed, it's always been, if that's the definition of fascism, it's always been fascist. So it's always been fascistic, at least, especially in its very early days with the Dutch East India Company as well as the British East India Company. The British East India Company would come in later, and they would dominate India, and that's a much more well-known story of how that came to be. And how much of the wealth of India of Britain is based on the plundering of India, but they were also had the Royal African Company, which was the biggest slaveholding company that they had as well. So that was not necessarily part of the British East India Company, but was a kind of competing interest there. But also had a very similar history to the British East India Company. So the history of these corporations that are quasi-state operations go way back. They go to the very dawn of capitalism, and if we look at what's going to happen next in this upcoming presidency, Elon Musk is really very much looking to merge, the United States with X, USX. It's the kind of direction we're headed. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, because it's very interesting to me because on the one hand, all of capitalism is somewhat a con, but if you look at someone like Jeff Bezos, his capital is much more real than Elon Musk's. Elon Musk just kind of lies and sells a dream, and then eventually delivers a product down the line. But the product doesn't really come till later. It's usually not that good, and there's actually better come where everybody's selling a dream and a hoax, right? Trump, very similarly, he's selling these things. So you have basically these two grifters who are going to be, in Mussolini-type positions, and I don't know how they're going to handle it. I mean, someone like, in some ways, it's more chaotic, more dangerous, but in other ways, someone like Bezos would be a greater threat because he actually does do what he says he's going to do. He actually does create these things. So, I don't know. That's kind of my opening statement.
No, I love comments. It, man. I love it. And again, just for the audience, so that y'all understand what we're talking about. These aren't just old little companies that went away. At its highest evaluation, okay, the Dutch East India Company was worth 7 trillion American dollars contemporarily, right? When we look at the kind of power that this company wielded, right, it formed governments, quasi-governments, and operated just like a nation state. Again, to Matt's point, we tend to automatically see that this phrase, right, the government has the monopoly on violence, right? Governments have the right to make wars, and governments have the right to have armies, and governments have the right to set up jurisdictions, right? This was a literal corporation that did all of those things, and it acted like a multinational corporation. I mean, it really was, in many ways, one of the first multinational corporations. And for stock, you bought yourself in. I mean, it was essentially a Ponzi scheme. Let's look at, the Dutch East India Company, some powers that they had, all right? They had their own army. They had their own navy. They would set up judges and could utilize the power of execution in the nations that they worked out of. They struck their own coins, for God's sakes, man. I mean, that's quite a lot. Like the countries that the Dutch East India Company worked out of, Indonesia, India. Hell, they were in Indonesia for 150 years, by the way. After they dissolved, right, in 1799, they just passed on those shares directly to the Dutch government that continued to run Indonesia for 150 years. They were in Indonesia. They were in India. They were in Sri Lanka. They were in South Africa. And most famously, they were in China. And their actions in China end up leading directly to, right, the Boxer Rebellion, or the so-called Opium Wars, So that's just the Dutch East India Company when you start to look at what they've done. And it's a number of companies that really you could look at that all had these kind of powers or operate these kind of powers. So just a couple of these companies, right, off the top of my head, and we'll talk about. Okay, give me 1 second. Technology is tough sometimes. Schwabamo. Yep. Okay, so we have Coca-Cola that pretty much operated in the governance of Puerto Rico and has, I mean, a Coca-Cola executive has been the president of the country of Mexico, right? As you were mentioning with Chiquita earlier, companies like United Fruit Company pretty much toppled governments as they at wills and were backed with the full power of the United States military, and they pretty much terrorized all of Central America. In fact, the incredibly derogatory term that people use all the time, banana republic, comes from the way that they operated in Central America, just essentially removing these corporations, removing governments that interfered with their profit margins. You think about it these days, and it's used as a derisive term like, oh, these Central American countries that couldn't understand how democracy worked. No, these countries would elect leaders and they would be killed or couped based upon their reaction to the United States stockholders, right? You have Folgers that's been linked to all kinds of wars in Colombia. Um, Contemporarily, you have Burisma in Ukraine, you have BlackRock, and we'll come into all of those corporations, at least Burisma and BlackRock, a little bit later on. But just a quick primer for like the real power that these corporations had over people's literal life and death.
Something that I think is always a trend is, Europe doesn't have the resources, the natural resources that the rest of the world does. And I'm seeing sort of all of the ways that that manifests. I've heard words like things like resource curse and things like that, because it seems like at the end of the day, like Europe just doesn't have what it needs to be resource stable or resource efficient. And I just wanted to know, like, I can start with you, Matt. Sort of like what are the ramifications of just this resource extraction, all over the world, in regard to the global South versus the West.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the major things that happened, like in the 1800s. I mean, today, you have all kinds of. It's a little more. The markets are more open, so different things happen with different interests. But back in the the 16 to 1800s, you had direct colonization of places, and so with the direct colonization of nations, what you ended up having was a lot of, in terms of like foodstuffs, you had a lot of like monoculture. So like a piece of land would grow a number of different crops, and they would rotate their crops because that's the way they keep the crops healthy and add variety to your diet, etc. But when colonization comes in, they end up turning the crop into one crop, because that crop is not necessarily made for consumption of the native population, and that crop is not necessarily made for the consumption of people in the market. That crop is made for money.
Yeah,
Like the consumption.
Famously
Yeah,
in Egypt, you have strawberries. They grow, I believe, the most strawberries of any country in the world, and they're all for the American market.
off the American market. And so, but I'm just saying, but in the early days, so you'd have all this kind of crazy monoculture. So even within Europe, you had the Irish potato famine. And the Irish potato famine is a result of the monoculture of potatoes in Irish soil. Later on, you have the Bengal famine, where people in India are starving because of British practices there. And this thing happens all over the world. But like Egypt growing all these strawberries being consumed by the American market. I mean, there's some like absurdities. Like I'll give you some of the most absurd things that are going on to this day. Um, uh, Mexico is the world's second largest importer of corn, and that's just ridiculous. I mean, the people of Mexico don't need the global market to teach them how to eat corn. The biggest exporter of rice in the world is the Philippines. The biggest importer of rice in the world is Thailand. So the Thais and the Filipinos don't need the global market to interfere with their ability to consume rice. You know what I'm saying? You have all this like rice being grown in Thailand, being shipped out of the world, and all this rice being grown in Philippines also being shipped, but also being imported, and also all this import. And so the reality is that's just so that companies like Cargill can get their hand on it. I mean, they don't need to be eating rice from like other countries. They can eat their own rice. They've grown rice ever since people lived there. And with the case of corn, I mean, corn is one of the first genetically modified foods. It's not actually, it doesn't really grow in the wild. It was actually developed in central Mexico and was spread across the Americas. But so like they really don't need farmers in Iowa to teach them how to eat corn. This is really absurd. So But this is the global market. It's not produced for consumption. It's produced for sale. But I mean, everything in the world that we live in is not produced for things of material use, but for their sale in the market. So that's how capitalism works. But it seems particularly nefarious when it comes to how people actually feed and live and die. I mean, it's just it's just when you look at the global food chain, the amount of crimes that are committed, to this day. I mean, you have all these people, all these farmers in India killing themselves because they're being forced to plant seeds that can only grow one crop, and you can't, you know, it's horrendous. It's horrendous. It's just all across the world.
Amoj, I want to ask you this, and Matt, you can jump in too. We see that China is creating the Belt and Road Initiative. It's so far become, so far looking very successful. Not only that, we had Donnie J come out yesterday talking about BRICS, talking about how he wants to tear down BRICS and sort of push that away. And it looks like kind of BRICS is doing good business. And as you guys were mentioning and talking about the Dutch East India Company and Chiquita and all those other, it doesn't seem as if they like to do good business. It seems as though they like to do bad business, and they like to exploit as much as possible. And we see now that the Belt and Road Initiative is allowing goods to flow more freely without these mega corporations necessarily having as much power. Do you see the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'll start with Emoji, man, you can jump in. Do you see the Belt and Road Initiative sort of kind of putting an end to sort of like these larger exploitative transnational corporations?
I mean, it really just depends, right? Because again, the Chinese are not. So, one thing about the Belt and Road Initiative is to remember that it's just a reimagination of the ancient Silk Road, which operated for literal thousands of years of human civilization. I mean, the Romans were utilizing the Silk Road to sell goods, to buy goods from the Far East, right? China is creating this thing as a, for lack of a better word, and people get pissed, but the truth is a gift to the world because the Chinese want to be traders, right? That's the thing. Like when you're looking at what China's motif is right now, like all of these countries have their own thing. Russia wants to be seen as tough again, Imperial Russia, we're strong, you can't push us around. The Chinese are like, we don't really want no smoke. We want to trade, like, and so because it's not a thing that is owned by a corporation, right? It's not something that can then be monopolized. But again, it's a resource that just because that resource was created and is available all doesn't mean that it cannot be used in those ways. A smart corporation in Central Asia, could utilize this as the 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 Amazon of Asia, right, would be able then to tap into an infrastructure project that allows you to take goods literally at speed from anywhere in China to as far as they already had worked themselves all the way up to Ukraine, right? So like these are one of those things where like the Chinese had investments in Ukraine, which is why like there is a level to like the utilization of weapons in the theater because the Russians don't want to interfere with Chinese, who are a partner to them in many projects, their potential investments in Ukraine. Right. This is why China wants to see the Ukraine war resolved as soon as possible because it allows them to continue to build and have roads that go directly to European markets. Also, again, in the Middle East, there were plans to take roads all the way from Beijing to Johannesburg. And that cannot happen so long as the market is unstable by activities like what is happening in Syria, what is happening all throughout the Levant. And so again, right, it's just one more way that the West can stifle the growth of any potential competitor that would come out of the Chinese markets. It's a way of strangulating BYD before they can even get out to these markets in this real way. It's a way of strangling Huawei before they can even really get out into these markets. So it exists as a tool, but because it's owned by a corporation, a country whose primary focus is not colonialization, but in fact is just global trade, no one literally right now has that monopoly. The way that the Americans utilize it, right now, the Americans have the oceans, right? So they utilize their navy to essentially strong arm and enforce global trade. But the Chinese are making land roads as opposed to oceanic roads, which again goes back to the inherent conflict that is looming between the United States and the Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, whether or not this particular project, is the thing that does it, or what's going on. I mean, I would try to take a little more of a long view on this. I mean, if you really look at things since the 1950s, I mean, ever since the Bandung Conference, I mean, the China has been kind of the global leader in basically creating a multipolar, polar world, and it's still not there. That was like 70 years ago, and it's still not there. But these things take time. I mean, it took time for Europeans to become the dominant force in the world. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. That took hundreds of years, and it's going to take probably 150 to undo. I don't know. I mean, who knows exactly what it'll be or how it'll go? But the process of that being undone, the process of living in a more multipolar world that's based on a higher level technology than we had in the past, that process is underway. What will be the response to the United States? How will the United States respond to that? How will Europe respond to that? How will China lead the world into this? And these are all questions that I don't know the answer to, but I do know that this is a process that's been ongoing. This process did not begin, recently. This process did not begin in the last 20 years. This process has been ongoing. It's been part of decolonization. It's been part of the freedom struggles throughout Latin America, the freedom struggles throughout Asia, the freedom struggles throughout Africa, the freedom and the distortions of those freedom struggles. It's all part of the same story, and how it all play out is open to it's an unwritten check. But the fact that this is part of that, the fact that BRICS should be seen not just isolated. BRICS has to be seen in the same context as OPEC. As in the same context as all these different other attempts and maneuvers that have been made to make the world a multipolar place. I mean, it has to be seen in the context of what of the Bolivarians. I mean, of what they were trying to do, and it needs to be seen in the context of what's happening here in Mexico. With Morena and the party that is not just one person. It wasn't just AMLO. It's a whole party. It's a whole party structure out here in Mexico that is enforcing these changes and making them structural. In Colombia right now, there's someone by Colombian standards a very progressive president. But I was in Colombia. You can still feel the state apparatus there. They're very much they don't have. And I'm not faulting him. I'm not faulting the president. I'm just saying it's one person as opposed to like people really taking over and within the government. So this process by which an American president, a horrible bigot, a gross exaggeration of the American presidency, steps up and just tells the Mexican president what's what, and she responds like, well, if you do that, we'll do this. If you start deporting people, we'll deport 2 million Americans. If you do that, we'll put tariffs on everything coming into Mexico. So basically, the idea that Mexico could stand up to the United States 20 years ago, that'd be unheard of. But again, that is also part of a decades-long process. That did not just happen with the Morena Party victories. I mean, this is an ongoing thing, and it's going to keep going that direction, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, 100%, right? And when we see, I think the real impact of things like when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative is, again, as we're saying, with the Dutch East India Company, right? One of the other forms of increasing currency was straight up dead ass piracy, right?
Yeah.
Because their navy was so big, and it's like, fuck you, we'll take your shit, and we'll bring it to the market, right? Belt and Road makes those type of frameworks that much harder because again, this isn't a resource access to this infrastructure that is controlled by the West, right? So it can't be pirated in that way. It creates its own security apparatus of guaranteed framework between all these nations, which it then deals as equals. And it shows, right, in the way that these Belt and Road Initiative countries, right, as well as the BRICS nations, right, are working together to increase global trade in ways that make sense in 21st century ways. You have no further look than this project that just happened in Peru, where the Americans create a port that's the largest port in South. I'm sorry, not the Americans, the Chinese, with the Peruvian government, right, create a port that is the largest port in South America, which allows a direct road for BRICS nation Brazil, right, to trade their goods to Peru, which then brings all of those goods to market specifically in East Asia in a way, whereas what would have happened 15 years ago, really even 10 years ago, the Brazilian markets would have had to ship out to the Atlantic Ocean, probably through the Amazon, go through the Caribbean Ocean, go through, the still American control Panama. Theoretically, the Panamanian Canal is run by Panama, but let's be honest, Panama is a proxy for American power and has been for quite some time, up to the point where it's even American assets were the president of this country, right? Manuel Noriega being the most famous, an actual operative of Langley, right, is the president of the country until he starts to really believe he's the president and he has to be removed. You avoid all of that now. The Americans can't control what goes to market from Brazil simply by closing access to the Panamanian Canal. They can build directly out to Peru and ship to markets with really no interference from the Americans at all. And so you can see how it becomes a threat to the way that especially the Western multinational corporation framework is set, which is inherently exploitative. Before then, the only way you could get these kind of projects for infrastructure would be to go to the World Bank, would be to go to the IMF, which of course are going to look at the needs of the American and Western and prioritize their corporations. You can build these projects, but you're going to have to use, what was Dick Cheney's Halliburton. 40% of this of the resources we're giving you from this loan are going to be tied to utilizing these corporations like Halliburton that are operating at an outrageous profit. And so those countries are always up in more debt, even when they do infrastructure, because the money's already allocated to Western corporations, which are taxing the hell out of those countries. Because the whole point is for them not to develop, and that's again what was talked about in Confessions of an Economic Hitman. The whole point is for them never to achieve self-sustainability.
Matt, we hear a lot of about sort of the devastating impacts of these mega corporations. Something that I think of often is Nestle sort of saying that they want to privatize water.
That humans don't have a natural right to water. I mean, that's cartoonish evil.
Yeah, and there's several examples of this. We see when it comes to things like toxic waste being left all over the place. When it comes to any country that has oil or rare earth minerals or anything like that, it seems as if the wealth of those countries never the wealth of those extractions of resources never seem to trickle down into the public there. And just in general, what are some things that come to mind in terms of just the crazy and dehumanizing and violent things that these big companies end up doing to their populations?
If you look at the two poorest countries, per capita of the Americas, right? I believe it's Haiti and Bolivia. And Haiti is still paying. Haiti for a long time, I think done now, but they were paying reparations to France for the loss of having to, the loss of the slaveholder, and that was for 100 years. It was wild. if you look at the case of Bolivia, some of the Spanish wealth was actually built off one silver mine in a place called Potosi, and that was in San Luis Potosi in Bolivia. And so much wealth was extracted from this mine, and they were sending these poor local Bolivians down the mine, and they were dying in horrible numbers, so much so they said the Mao needs men, right? So this is what was going on. This is how so much that wealth was built. Well, fast forward to today, Bolivia is the country has the most lithium mines in the world, right? And so now Bolivia is being extracted all this lithium is coming out to enrich Elon Musk and Tesla, the corporation.
We'll
And I mean, it's
whoever we want.
We will coup whoever we want, as what Elon Musk had to say about the potential overthrow of the overthrow of Evo Morales. So I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's going on, and what I find is that you find in these stories, you find this long histories, but you find that the same countries are perpetuating the same crimes and against the same victims. I mean, like these are the countries that have been designated to suffer. I mean, and it's really all over the world, but the most egregious examples stay egregious. We mentioned earlier Coca-Cola. I mean, Coca-Cola was hiring death squads in Colombia to murder union leaders. I mean, this is
it's not innocuous. It's not have a Coke and a smile, right?
Yeah.
And it's so funny to me because Americans, right, like American liberals are just so damn insufferable with phraseologies like decolonize your mind. Like, you cannot do that when you're having a McDonald's burger and a Coke, right? Like that falls flat, right? When the McDonald's organization is feeding in many ways enabling, oppressive regimes like the Israelis and their IDF and everything you just said about Coca-Cola. I mean, literally, they've killed people. They've killed people to control places like Puerto Rico for Seagrams, ostensibly for their sugar creating capacity, right? Like these are not innocent, fun, and again, they're just the tip of the iceberg. It gets way worse than Coca-Cola.
Yeah. This is sort of like my final question. I'll start with you, Tanky, and of course, Matt, you can jump right in whenever. We are yesterday or this morning, Joey B decided to pardon Hunter Biden for the last 10 years worth of whatever criminal activity happened within the last 10 years.
Anything that may or may not have happened.
So yeah, we don't quite know exactly what it is, but something that I was thinking of, and Emoji, you mentioned this a little earlier with Burisma, is Hunter Biden was receiving tens of thousands of dollars on a monthly basis from Burisma. So, mind you, this is not a person that understands energy. He's an author and an artist
and a painter,
and he was, basically involved directly with so much about Ukraine. And we talked about this, and we talk about this often, man. And this is one of the biggest reasons I wanted to have this conversation is BlackRock owns a significant portion of Ukraine, like a good amount of what's allowed or what is available for purchase. And it seems like Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, and BlackRock have taken over Ukraine. And because of that, they have a vested interest in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, and all others known to be rare earth minerals. And it seems that we are on the brink of World War III. Not simply, I don't want to say simply because that's...
World War III has begun. It's just low intensity as far as the Americans are concerned, right? Which goes back to the whole relativity of the situation. I think if you're in Aleppo right now, you're not asking has World War III begun, right? You know for a fact that it has. I think if you're in the Kursk region of Russia, you're not asking has World War III begun. You know for a fact that it already has. It's just low intensity as it relates to Americans. And yeah, Burisma is a great example. They fit 100% into this because little Burisma, went up against one of the largest corporations in the world, Gazprom, which is an incredible oil producer. Essentially, they're 50% state-owned, right? So these are the aspects of socialism that are still kind of worked into the Russian economy, even though, they're quite capitalist. They're still not capitalist the way the Americans are, right? And so this is an investment that's backed by a silent partner of the government, a silent majority partner. You know what I'm saying? So little bitty Burisma went up against multinational, well, not multinational because Gazprom is a Russian corporation. You know what I'm saying? But they had an ace in the hole. They had an energy advisor in Hunter Biden. And so you now have access, a direct line to, at that time, the vice president of the United States of America, right? So that allows you geopolitical strength that allows you to punch way beyond what should be your ordinary capacity. And to no small effect, we are here at the brink of not even casual World War III, but hot nuclear war, World War III, because Joe Biden had to protect his son and his son's dealings, right? I mean, again, these things go far beyond political affiliations. These are not things we say because we hate Democrats, though I hate Democrats. I don't say them because I love Republicans, because I hate Republicans. They're just as guilty, right? And that's where you get the whole BlackRock. BlackRock is an organization. It's important to consider all of these corporations are beyond mere things like party affiliation. Yeah, you still have some billionaires like the Koch brothers and all of their industries where they have a single-minded focus on these kind of things and specific social issues. But in the era of Citizens United, I spend whatever is the maximum, right? If I'm a company like BlackRock, I spend the maximum allowable amount to donate to the Democrats as I do the Republicans, because now I don't have to say what I want. You know what I want. I don't have to bribe you. You've already been bribed. If you don't do what I say, I don't have to. All I have to do is stop giving you money, and I'll double that money to the party that's going to do what I want, or just simply remove your access. And so because of that, right, they're equally invested in Republicans as they are Democrats. So you don't really get a change because the people that are financing these corporations will not allow that. They're not, gone are the days of the Bernie Sanders begging for money. I mean, he ain't gone are the days of him begging. He's still begging. But I mean, where like mostly your campaign is funded by $2 from Joe Black and $5 from Mary Sue, right? That's gone. Like you're getting $100,000 dinners at these at these corporations, to really build up the war chest for what it takes to run for president. And so when you look at what the American government is, they are literally normally just the acting agents of these corporations and the wills that they exist. BlackRock, even though Burisma was the foreplay, BlackRock is the main entree for why we are close to actualized World War III with Russia. Because now it is the interest of BlackRock versus the interest of Gazprom.
I mean, we look at
through the collective power of the West and NATO versus Russia's military apparatus.
But when you look at BlackRock, I mean, like it's a corporation that basically does so much behind the scenes. I mean, they during the 2008 bailouts, they were basically you had Geithner and you had Paulson and all these people on the phone with Larry Fink asking him for advice on what to do, and he's basically advising them to bail out companies that BlackRock was actually invested in. And so what they do is they invest in all the companies, and then they kind of tell the companies how to run their board. They pitch it as a wonderful thing, like, oh, boards are not responsive to the corporations, or and the corporations are responsible to the market, and we go in and we teach them responsibility. But what it's really saying is that, like, I am like the king of kings. I am the don of dons. I am the boss of bosses. I invest in companies, major companies, like Bank of America, Citigroup, probably Coca-Cola, and who knows what they have investments in. And I tell them what to do, and I tell them what I want, so I can synergize capitalism, essentially. And that's essentially what he's saying. And so that's their model with other corporations. So given government influence, that's going to be their model with governments, and not one government. Like governments. the world. That's going to be their model, which is basically the boss of bosses. You know?
Yeah. It just it always feels like, I mean, Elon Musk, y'all talked about a little bit earlier, and he has, the Starlink and the, whatever, what is the rocket company again? I can't remember, but, he's got that. I mean, Jeff.
SpaceX, and he's got Neuralink. That's the microchip you can put in your brain.
Oh, right. Starlink and your Neuralink and all the things that seem incredibly 1984 and dystopian in so many different ways. But you also have guys like Jeff Bezos. I mean, you got that you mentioned earlier before. I mean, there are Bill Gates with a significant foot within the land, American farmland himself. And these oligarchs, which are the owners, the CEOs or whatever it may be of these enormous companies, seem to wield incredible power and influence through their politics. And, we mentioned this, you guys are kind of dancing around this, but, and this is my last question for Matt, and then Tanky, you can jump in, how do these major corporations get so high into the political will and the political field, when there's supposed to be these rules involved that don't allow that?
Like anybody else, they build upon generations. So they're building upon what was done in the past generations. They're building upon the things that happened within the so-called Reagan Revolution. They're building upon deregulation. They're building upon public-private partnership. Elon Musk, for instance, is like, it's kind of funny. He's talking about these people that are on the government tit or whatever they're trying to say. Elon Musk is, to borrow a phrase, the biggest welfare queen in U.S. history. I mean, this guy is who he is because of the government, loans and all, et cetera, and the government backing and the government, the no bid stuff he got under the Obama administration. Obama made Tesla. I mean, Tesla's not that successful corporation. It really isn't. What he is very successful at is selling an image, an idea, the promise of tomorrow. That is what he's really good at. And when you talk about when you talk about him, how that happened, or how did that happen? How did the Wall Street take over of the economy? How did this happen? It's all just built upon they built upon the work of their predecessors, and it's getting further and further and further down the line. Like anybody does. They all build on the work of their predecessors, and so it just goes further and further and further down the line, and it's getting closer and closer to the point where they're really just hollowing out the shell of the post World War II, social welfare state. Which we've talked about social welfare state, so something happened in Europe, but no, the United States has a social welfare state as well. The freeways, your Social Security, et cetera, et cetera. They're looking to gut all of that in the same way that they gutted, what happened after the Soviet Union, how they gutted all the socialist states. And, the people who are behind that are some really cool liberal guys like Jeffrey Sachs, who liberals love Jeffrey Sachs, like George Soros. Liberals love George Soros. Well, those are the guys that gutted Eastern Europe. Those two in particular are the two that gutted. I mean, George Soros actually put the money in his pockets. Jeffrey Sachs was just an advisor, but he was advisor to Lech Walesa in Poland after the fall of the Soviet Union, and he ran them. They ran the country to the ground in the same way, in the same ways, in the same type of things that Milton Friedman was talking about. So there really is no, when it comes to imperialism, there is really no left-right split. I mean, it really is what it is. As far as we're talking about the Musk and the Bezos, and the final point I put here is that we're talking about, these guys are talking about, these guys are basically saying that the Earth is going to be uninhabitable in a very short period of time. And that's their major project, both of them. And they have two competing visions. And I sound ridiculous. I sound like a conspiracy nut, but you just look at what they said. You can watch their interviews. They both talk about it. The competing vision for Elon Musk is to put people on Mars, because that sounds cooler, right? But knowing Elon Musk, the biodome is going to collapse. It's going to end up in a fire. Millions are going to die if that's the play. Jeff Bezos' concept is to put everybody on space stations, kind of like the Death Star, giant space stations for people to go live on, right? And if you look at the way he runs an Amazon factory, I mean, you can only imagine what Planet Bezos would be like. And that sounds ridiculous. I sound conspiratorial, but no, that's what SpaceX is about, and that's what Blue Horizon is about. And if you don't believe me, go watch their interviews. I'll tell you straight up that's what they plan to do. And they're
Yeah.
not gonna say, I'm gonna turn the planet into a sweatshop. And they're not gonna say, I'm gonna bring everybody to Mars and I'm gonna try and drill on Mars and it's gonna collapse on everyone's head. Obviously, they're not gonna say those things. I'm telling you those things are gonna happen because I've watched their track record.
I mean, these are not rational men, right? I mean, was it a decade ago? Elon Musk sent a car to space because it was his favorite car. Like, what the, like, right? These are things, right? These are not the actions of rational men. These are the kind of things that megalomaniacal egoists do because they can. You know what I'm saying? And like, I, I just don't trust a megalomaniacal egoist to be the kind of person to create a grand utopia, right? Especially ones that come from South Africa, that literally their whole money is apartheid money and running essentially slavery emerald mines, right? Looting the wealth of a nation that you have no real indigenous ties to, right? So much of his framework, and even his forebears talk about that, right? Oh, we were so worried about little Elon. You know, he went to America and the liberal ideology took a hold of him. And I'm so happy to see that he's coming back to his roots. What roots were those? You know, white supremacist roots, you know, where he's giving speeches like, you know, there's no place in history where you can find there weren't slaves and slave owners, you know, and people are adding him on X like, okay, so when were your family slaves? Right? Like, oh, you're the slave owning family. That's inherent for a mega mind like you. It's only natural, right? So, like, these are the kind of ways that these people, this is the mind state, right? But even then, when you look at what this current last election was, it was the oligarchs running against the multinationals, right? So in a small way, corporations like BlackRock, though they have their investments in the Republican Party, they don't have the majority vote now because the actual oligarchs, which are actually closer to plutocrats, when you start to look at the wealth of a Bezos or the wealth of a space Karen, you know, like Elon Musk, they've went beyond even the term oligarch, right? I mean, Trump is an oligarch. He's worth a couple of billion. These guys are at least market evaluated at hundreds of billions, which bring you to the phrase of a plutocrat. And they don't want the inefficiency of the bureaucracy that comes with the multinational. They want to be able to make strong moves. They want to sit at the head and control the destinies of these things, as opposed to sit at a board and debate what possible paths to the future might look like. But
Because the board
again,
isn't going to say buy X. They're going to say it's a
right,
bad idea. Don't do that. But when you
right,
have someone who has the ability to just say, it's like the difference between, you know, Bruce Wayne and then like the Bruce Wayne board, you know, and that's why you kick Bruce
right.
Wayne off the board because he wants to do all this other stuff that maybe whatever whim he has. And that's not necessarily how the rest of these probably very conservative, very, I don't want to say conservative, but very particular in the way that they do business type of individuals because, you know,
Methodical,
methodical, I think
right?
is a
Which
great
can be
word.
slow and meandering.
You know, and or whatever it may be, it's not looking to make risky investments. It's looking to buy debt, you know, to exploit workers, you know, and cut costs. And that's what these large corporations do. Um, I want to I want to thank first of all our guest Matt Sedillo. Thank you so much, and Moshe Lo. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate you both. I just want to give a shout out to our podcast listeners. We're everywhere that you find podcasts. We are also here on YouTube. Like and subscribe. You know what it is. Send it to your friends. Say, hey, you know, we got this political thing that we watch, and it's pretty awesome. I want to give a shout out to our, you know, we do a Patreon, and just because we're trying to get bigger, we're trying to get better, and we're trying to make cleaner, sexier news. So first, I just want to give a shout out to our patrons. You can go to www. You can go to patreon.com/, inner city left. And we also have free subscriptions as well. But I want to give a shout out to Nikki Infield, Riggedy Pellegrino, Nat the Rat, Lucy Newman, Samantha Guerrero, Dumpy, Tom LeBeau, Turn Leftist, Dubz22, Jay Goulart 94, No Ground, RK, Paula Ponderosa, Lissa Piercy, Lauren Bullock, Susette, Tav, Demis Amadeus. I want to give the final word. I think Matt popped out, but I got.
Aha, he has returned.
I don't know if you can hear us, Matt. I just wanted to say thank you. And I guess if Matt, if you can't hear us, I'll give Emoja the last word for today. Thoughts on today's conversation and any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it just goes back to people think that these are things that only hurt the quote unquote developing world, but they hurt every single worker. This is why it's as important to when people say things like buy local, right? I'm pretty sure the local carpenter in your neighborhood was not responsible for the overthrow of some government somewhere across the world just to bring you the cheapest price on wood to build your table, right? These are the things that you get. The only real way to circumvent these kind of excess, right, is to buy as local as you can, to go back to your local people, the larger a corporation is, the more fundamentally violent their operation and outlook into the world are. Even companies that seem innocuous like McDonald's, right? Like multinational corporations go beyond loyalty, and yet because of their great wealth are able to utilize that to weaponize it to bring about whatever geopolitical ends they want. And it sounds conspiratorial, but the reality is history has proven this over and over again. And there's a direct line from corporations like the Dutch East India Corporation to BlackRock. I mean, it's just a straight line. So that's what I got for you guys. Hopefully we can get Matt back. Other than that,
Matt will definitely be back at some point. I think he's gone for now, but go ahead and buy his book. It'll be in the description. For Matt Sedillo, Emoji Little Tanky Summer, I am Amin TMK. This is the Inner City Left broadcast. Peace.
System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' Inner City Left.